His books are Long Island favorites, and he invites readers into a world of cops and sometimes North Shore opulence. Nelson DeMille is the author of more than 20 novels, and he's no stranger to the top of the New York Times bestseller list. His 1997 classic, Plum Island, introduced salty NYPD detective John Corey, who's back in action in The Maze, DeMille's new book and the subject of today's talk. Welcome, Nelson.
Thank you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mark Chisano. Thanks so much for coming to this Newsday Live Author Series event in partnership with Long Island LitFest. We're here at Newsday's new multimedia space, Studio 2. Very excited to be here, especially with the great Nelson DeMille.
Thank you.
Nelson, we really appreciate it. Yeah. Nelson's going to read a little bit from the beginning of the book. He's very kind, so we'll hear a little bit of the book right now.
How many people have read the book already?
Oh. All right, not that many, so we're getting a little.
So,
yeah.
okay. I will read part of the first page. I'm like, I hate to read my own stuff, but I'll give it a shot. Okay. You can't drink all day unless you start in the morning. It was 11 a.m. on a sunny June day, and I was sitting with a cold Budweiser in a deep wicker chair on the back porch of my Uncle Harry's big Victorian house overlooking the Great Peconic Bay. The uniform of the day, every day, was shorts and a t-shirt. My bare feet were propped on the porch rail, and on my lap were a pair of old binoculars and the New York Times crossword puzzle. Newsday crossword puzzle. I've been chilling here for about 3 weeks, and as I said the last time, I was borrowing Uncle Harry's summer house. The problem with doing nothing is not knowing when you're finished. I put my beer down on a side table next to my 9mm Glock. There's more?
Beautiful, beautiful.
I'm done?
The Glock. Thank you. The Glock on the mantelpiece, you know. Well, a lot of DeMille fans probably recognize that, right? It's sort of similar to the beginning of Plum Island, right?
Yeah, yeah.
How much were you thinking about that going in? Was that on your mind? You wanted to start that way?
Yeah, you know, how many people read Plum Island? Maybe I should say
wow.
that. Okay, I think everybody.
Everybody, yeah.
This is kind of, it's not a sequel, but it kind of picks up, you know, in the same, you know, you see the same venue, same locale on his uncle's back porch. And but the book is about, it's a fictionalized version of the Gilgo Beach murders. And I call it in this book the Fire Island murders. I started researching it. It's such a complex case. I didn't want to get lost in the weeds, so let me fictionalize it. And that was the original idea, and then, you know, the editors were, you know, thrilled with it. But then I needed to put people and characters in the book, and it had been a while since John Corey had a job, so last time we saw him, he was basically fired from the diplomatic surveillance group. So I brought him back, and it fit right in because it was, you know, the same kind of locale, and I put him on the back porch of his uncle's house, and, you know, we went from there. A lot of the characters from Plum Island who we hadn't seen in a while, like Beth Penrose, his old lover, and Chief Maxwell are in this book, and some new characters. And I kind of had fun writing it. You know, they say if the author's having fun, the reader will have fun. That's what they say. I'm not sure that's true.
Right. I mean, the book starts with this almost panoramic tour of all these. It's almost a reunion, right, of these characters.
Yeah, you know, and that's one of the challenges of writing a series. There's so much backstory because this is John Corey number 8, actually. And you know, when I wrote Plum Island, I didn't start out to write a series. I had never written a series before. And I love to read series, and, you know, I guess we all do, and everything from Sherlock Holmes to Agatha Christie. But I had never done it before. Plum Island, you know, you've all read it. You can see it was a standalone book. This is not introducing a series or a series character. But when the book was published, it just went right through the roof. I mean, it was like, obviously I'd hit on a character, John Corey, politically incorrect and somewhat obnoxious. And the book stayed 17 weeks on the New York Times list, debuted, I think, at #1, if I'm not mistaken. It just went gangbusters, and it was kind of surprised me. I shouldn't have been surprised I wrote it, but then, so my agent at the time and my editor said, why don't we do a sequel? Not a series, he said a sequel. I said, I don't do sequels, I don't do series. So I went on to something else. I can't remember which one it was, but it was not a John Corey book. And then the fan mail started to come in, and it was like, they wanted to see, fans wanted to see John Corey again. And I still like this because, I like to create what we call standalones, but then my agent showed me the royalty statement, and
that's how it goes. So, that's what happens.
Maybe we can talk.
Do you identify with John Corey?
Yeah, you have to ask my ex-wife. No, not really. I mean, John, I know a lot of NYPD, a lot of Suffolk County and Nassau County cops, and he's really a composite of a lot of cops that I've known over the years. My uncle was a cop. They're very colorful, but the thing about creating, cops, especially NYPD, especially homicide, is it's been done 1,000 times before, and you got to bring something new to it. And I just started at Corey. This is back in '97. I think it was Plum Island was '97. I needed every cop character has got to have some kind of a shtick that makes him different. And I decided John Corey was going to be politically incorrect. He's going to be outrageous. And my editor read the first draft, and she said, "Oh my God, this guy is sexist. He's obnoxious, and but he's lovable." The New York Times reviewed this book, which I don't normally review my books. And
do you read your reviews? You're not supposed to do that
one I read because I wanted to see what this review had to say. And her pull line, the best line from the review, which was that this book is enraging but engaging. So I give her credit. She was offended by the book, but she was engaged by it, and she said it. And that was a little bit brave to say, I love this sexist character.
Right. It was kind of a John Corey thing to say, that she was kind of straightforward with it. Yeah.
I think I converted it by the end of the book.
Right. Do you think, to me, I think John Corey is politically incorrect for sure, but he's also just super funny, right? His one-liners are great, right? I love, there's a line in here there's no spoilers, but he's talking to his parents, and his mom says, make sure you're wearing sunscreen or whatever, and he's making fun of his mom, and he has this really funny kind of reaction to the parents. Is the humor an important part of this to you? Do you find it fun to write humor?
Yeah, that was the other thing. Most cops, are funny, and most of the cop books, you get these great one-liners, and John, it sounds like John Corey is very quick, meaning, I must be very quick, but the nice thing about writing is you can freeze time. Somebody says something, and I sit there for 15 minutes saying, what is John's comeback to this? Well, you can't do this in real life. If you miss the moment, you miss the moment. But when you take the time and you think about it and you play with it, when the reader reads it, hopefully it sounds like but nobody's that quick, believe me.
There's just another one I love, which, again, this is no spoilers, but, one of John's girlfriends during the book says, she says, "I can't wait to meet your parents." And he says, "Let me know when you do." That's great. Yeah. Do you, it's funny you say about kind of you have time to write the rejoinders, because sometimes in this book, you write what he doesn't say, right? You write what he wants to say.
Right, yeah.
Is that something that's important to you? Do you ever kind of do that kind of self-censorship and don't say what you're thinking,
I think we all do, but we think it, but we don't say it. And he mostly says what he wants to say, and then he has another thought, which is maybe his private thought. And that's one of the things too, when you're writing, what goes between the quotation marks, as you know, Mark, you wrote a novel, what goes between the quotation marks and what is the narrative, and that's a decision you have to make along the line. Some things that you might think, if you said them, they would sound stupid or corny, but they sound different. The same line would sound different as an inner thought, and vice versa. So, You know, and he does this all through the book. He says one thing and then he thinks another. There was a little censorship in this book in terms of my editor at Simon & Schuster had some serious issues with some of the things in the book. That's a long story. I won't get into it, but
less self-censorship than just.
Well, you know, the book, and you might have noticed because you're in the business, that was my first book with Simon & Schuster was a Simon & Schuster book. This is a Scribner book. Same company, but I had to slide out of Simon & Schuster into Scribner because we had some editorial issues, and I kind of won the battles, but they said to me, "The world has changed, Nelson." I said, "Well, yeah, but John Corey has not, you know." And some of the things I found offensive, but I listen. I mean, I listen, and I write. I co-author books with my son, who's 42, and he's got a different, you know, a different head. He's from, you know, he comes from a different place in terms of, you know. And I say, you know, he reads my books before in manuscript form, and I said, you know, "Alex, is this offensive?" He says, "Yes." I said, "Should I leave it in?" He said, "Yes."
Well, you're writing a character that's a specific, you know, of a specific place and time and group. But he's also, you know, he is politically incorrect, but he also kind of cares about some of the other characters, right? I mean, there's a great passage where where he feels bad about being undercover and deceiving some of the elderly, you know, people in the book. So he has like a conscience, right? It's not just.
He's got a moral center, and the book is about, you know, the 10 murdered prostitutes, and he cares about them. You know, he says justice has to be done. Doesn't matter that they were prostitutes. Justice has to be done. So he's got a moral core, you know, and that's the thing that's kind of a saving grace. You know, if you read it, he says one thing, but he treats people well. I think, you know, is a complex character to create because, you know, again, outwardly he seems a little bit, you know, cavalier about some things, and he makes jokes about things that are not that funny, but deep down inside, we know his inner thoughts, which is a nice thing about a novel that you can't do in a movie. So we know who he really is, and then he's got the persona that he's putting out to the world. So, you know, I think that works. Yeah.
Well, he's also a clean cop, right?
Yeah,
like to a fault, kind of.
Yeah.
And that's different than a lot of the cops in this book.
Exactly.
You know, I think you seem to sort of revel in the cop language in the book, right? Like tinning, right? Like not being tinned.
Right.
A lot of the paperwork, right? Do you have some favorite language or some favorite kind of pieces that you learned about police world?
You know, I do. Now I live in Garden City, and I live down, and my favorite bars are down the street from the courthouses, and you know and I hang out with ADAs, you know, and I hang out with cops, and you listen, you know, you listen. If you're a novelist, you listen, and you want to get the jargon right. It's not, you know, I said my uncle was a cop, but it wasn't jargon I grew up with. You know, when I created some of my military novels, some of, you know, like Word of Honor and Upcountry, you know, remember that language from my 3 years in the Army, and that was kind of easier to produce. And you know what an officer sounds like, you know what a tough sergeant would sound like. The world of cops was a little bit different, but you know, I listened, but also, you know, I had people read it. I always acknowledge, in all of my John Corey books, a man named Kenny Heeb, whose career was a cop, but his career kind of followed John Corey's. He was NYPD homicide, then he became a contract agent with the Joint Terrorist Task Force, and then he became an agent with the Diplomatic Surveillance Group. So his career followed John Corey. In Plum Island, and you remember that Corey was unemployed at the end because he had 3/4 disability. He couldn't go back to the NYPD. But when my agent and my editor and the royalty statement convinced me I needed to bring John Corey back, I said to Kenny Heeb, "What, you know, this guy, can he go back?" He said, "No, he's got 3/4. He can't ever go back." I said, "Well, what can he do? You know, you got to give this guy a job that's interesting. He can't be, you know, a guard at Costco or something." So he said, "Well, you can do what I'm doing." He says, "I'm a contract agent with the Joint Terrorist Task Force." This is pre 9/11, and a lot of us didn't know what the
wow.
Joint Terrorist Task Force was, and it's made up of NYPD retired and active duty with FBI. It's, the one in New York is headquartered at 26 Fed. There were a few others back in the 90s, a few other Joint Terrorist Task Force around the country, but not many. But now they're all over the country. And I kind of got an insight into this world of retired, young retired cops. I mean, you go on a job at 20, you're out by 40. What were they doing? They were getting jobs as contract agents with the feds, mostly the FBI. And because terrorism was something that it wasn't 9/11 yet, but it was, there.
Sure.
And this was a growth industry, is what I'm trying to say. So he said, make John, contract agent. So in the second book, The Lions Game, that's what he was. And then.
Did he follow all the way through? So is he now a private eye?
My friend, no.
Oh, okay.
That's where we parted ways.
Okay.
No, he's not a private eye, but I think when he, after he read the book, I think he thought about it.
Yeah, right. They make good money in the book, you'll learn. Well, and private investigators are in the news right now, right? With, being sort of hired by Iran and China to do kind of their dirty work.
Yeah.
I'm just curious if that was that kind of stuff was on your mind while you were working.
No, not when I started writing the book about 2 years ago, but you're right, but I remember, the heyday of the private eye. We all remember from the 30s, Philip Marlowe and, the 1930s, 40s, into the 50s, the private eye movies, the private eye books, and then it kind of died off. And by the 70s was the rise of crime all over the world in New York City. Then we went to vigilante groups and some movies made about vigilantism and also cops. It had crooked cops like Serpico, which was not a novel but nonfiction, not fiction. And that was that era. So the private eye is coming back, I see, and it's an interesting world because they are mostly retired cops, usually detectives, who are now in the private sector. And I think, there may be, I don't think we've seen much in TV or movies about, the private eye yet, but I think that's probably, maybe on the horizon.
Interesting. Well, and, you guys will see when you start reading the book, John Corey's not happy to be private eye, right? He's this is not a choice he would have made.
Right. Yeah.
Do you, they're in the when John Corey goes to work for this private eye shop, he kind of is hanging around with the other private eyes, and he's in that room together, and they get up to some no good. But he has this moment of nostalgia, right, where he's like, oh, I kind of like being here among the guys, like drinking and chatting. I'm just curious if you've had that sense of nostalgia for a certain environment or kind of group before. It felt very real in the book.
Well, thanks. Yeah, I mean, I try to just picture what he would be thinking as a man who had been off the job for many years. All the cops that I speak to are retired. I say, do you miss the job? Yeah, we miss it, and. I miss the people. They always say I miss the people, and to be a 20-year cop, detective, or whatever is more of a calling than a job, and this is like sort of paramilitary. I know from the Army, people miss it, because it's not 20 years ago. Watch out! It's like part of who you are, and that's what I try to represent in the book. That he is kind of at a loose end since his. Disability, and he found sort of a home with the Joint Terrorist Task Force, and he found a little bit of a home with the Diplomatic Surveillance Group, and the private eye thing. His girlfriend Beth, I won't give the whole book away, but she's trying to convince him to take this job. She says it's sort of like you're home again with all these private detectives are all former NYPD and Suffolk County and Nassau County cops, so. That kind of convinces him.
Yeah. It's funny, he's kind of a guy without a home, right? Like that's sort of his vibe.
Yeah. He has trouble with women too, and
he definitely has trouble with women. That is true. But do you think, I don't know, do you envision a happy ending for him? Does he ever change, or does he kind of stay the same forever?
Well, that's a good question. Happy ending for him. Yeah, he's smart. He's gonna want. We are talking about the last John Corey book, the last in the series, and it's so difficult. We've all seen like The Sopranos. We've seen some, great series on TV, and some of them end well, and they got a great ending, and some of them just have not good endings. And sometimes with the series, you don't really know when it's going to end. But sometimes you plan the ending. Like, Conan Doyle got so, authors sometimes get sick of the series character. You live with him for so long. Conan Doyle, when he created Sherlock Holmes, it was a phenomenon. It was like a huge bestseller, and it made him a lot of money. But he got sick of Holmes, and he decided to get rid of him, and he had Professor Moriarty push him over the Reichenbach Falls, and he died. And then his fans were outraged, America and England were outraged. And
allegedly died.
Right, and then Conan Doyle realized he had to bring this guy back because, 20 years ago I was in Switzerland and I said to my wife, we have to go to the Reichenbach Falls, I want to check it out. And we did. And I said, nobody survives this fall. I mean, he's dead.
Something's wrong here. Yeah.
But I know the feeling. I mean, I speak to Lee Childs, a friend of mine, and Harlan Coben, and Michael Connelly, and I know, as much as you love the character in one way, you're kind of tired of him in another way. You want to do something different, and also with the series character, there's so much baggage that that accumulates book by book. Up to book 15, you have to decide how much you want to tell of the past and how much you just want to go forward. And the editors want you to go forward, but the reader has this feeling that if I'm coming into this series, where am I coming into it? And so, those are the complexities. But I definitely have planned an ending, which is one more book. I think it's the ending, but it probably is not going to be.
Right.
But I want to, but that's to answer your question. I think he'll have a happy ending.
He'll have an ending and a home. Right. And it's not going to be a Sopranos like 50 blank pages, You go to the end, what's going on? Again, not to give away the ending, but I think we can say reliably that there's an interesting fight scene, right? Fair to say.
Yeah.
I think it's great. It's a great fight scene. How do you choreograph those? Do you draw them out on a map? Do you think it through beforehand? What's your process?
Oh, yeah. Most of these books end with a shootout at the end, and they're very difficult to. They are difficult to choreograph. That's what it is. It's choreography. Yeah. You got to kind of slow up time, and they are difficult. Maybe the most difficult part of the book is any action adventure where there's a lot of action adventure, and this is the only place where I think movies can sometimes do a better job. My son is a screenwriter, and the book that we wrote together, The Deserter, there is that action adventure at the end, and he wrote it as though it was like kind of a movie, and it was maybe too quick. So I showed him how to milk it out a little bit because this is what people want to read, but it can't be too slow because then it's not action adventure. It's like, so the pacing is very important when you're doing when those final bullets are flying and people are, it's all about the pacing. It's all about believability. How many bullets could John Corey survive? How many could miss him? Are these guys really that bad a shot? We've all seen these bad movies with submachine guns all over the place, and nobody seems to get hit. So, for a writer, it's a challenge, probably more of a challenge than a director, who has all the visuals. There's no visuals, so you have to bring the reader into the world of the book. And when you're writing first person, and all Corey books are first person, at least you can get into John's head, like what he's thinking about,
what he's feeling and afraid of.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
Well, and it seems like you don't, go with the submachine gun, missing all the bullets strategy. You sort of carefully place like who's wearing a Kevlar vest, who's got a gun that has no bullets left, which I think adds to the reality of it, right?
Yeah, but you don't do this in one take, believe me. Right. Like, most of my chapters are 3 or 4 or 5 drafts maybe. The final chapters could be 7 or 8 drafts. You really got to go back and forth, back and forth. And sometimes you forget, like, this guy, this scene would be better if he wasn't wearing a Kevlar vest. So you got to take that vest off and every chapter, and you got to play with it. It's got to be fluid, and also it's the final chapter usually is a long chapter because it is this choreographed ending. But you got to keep the reader engaged. Readers like to end the chapter, but with the ending, it's got to be that. If it was a movie, it would be the last 7 or 8 or 9 minutes of the movie kind of thing. It's a challenge. It's a big challenge, and up to that point, everything that came before should make the scene believable. Not just the good guy, not just the Corey character, but the bad guys. How smart are they? How stupid are they? What are they carrying? And do they have a night scope, or do they not have a night scope? And then, in the first draft, they didn't, and then they gave it to him, gave him a night scope. Then I took it away from him, and then
keep that in mind.
I don't want to give away the
right. Well, you know the Kurt Vonnegut thing about put a character in a tree and throw rocks at them, right? I feel like you're kind of doing that here. Like John Corey, it's got a tough time for John Corey. You know, everything that can go wrong is going wrong.
But the reader knows. The reader probably knows he's going to survive. He's not going to be pushed. So but you have to make it tense. But sometimes I have a partner with them, like a Beth Penrose, and you say, the reader is saying, I know this idiot author is going to kill off this girl just to have somebody die in the scene. So you can't telegraph it, and it can't be formula, but yet it's got to be within some kind of believable matrix that everybody can believe, and I think. The last, maybe, I don't know, in this case it was about 50 pages of the book. Probably took as long as the previous 200 pages. Because that's the last thing the reader remembers is the scene at the end, and it's got to be, it's got to be a payoff for the reader. I mean, they say, the old thing in playwriting, if you show a gun in the first act, you better use it in the third act. And we've seen this. We've seen the gun. We've seen other paraphernalia throughout the book, and then it all comes together at the end.
That's right. Including the title, right? In some
maze,
ways. Did you? By the way, it's again, it's a great conceit and it's a great ending. Did you see a maze and just think I got to set something in a maze? Did you have it in your head beforehand? Like, how did you come up with that?
It's a double. It's a double entendre. It's a maze of corruption. I mean, this is the literary part. It's a maze of corruption, and there's a maze. So right from the beginning, I knew that the last scene was going to take place in a maze. And out east, we know that. I have a 16-year-old, and I've taken him through so many corn mazes I could blow my brains out. And so it was going to be a corn maze originally, but then I realized that this book is ending in July, and the corn maze would be about high. And that was an issue. I had to actually go back and say, well, one farmer, in order to increase his revenue, decided to plant a hedge maze, and then which is permanent. It's not the seasonal corn maze; it's a hedge maze, and so it's there when I needed it. I needed it in July. So But that was a thing that I had to go back to. But you had to think about it ahead of time, and
you got to plan it out.
Right.
Well, and then the other entendre of the maze, right? Like you said, is the corruption. How much are you pulling from the stories of corruption in Suffolk County, like Burke and Spoda, and the real stories that
and James Burke, Burke read the book, by the way. James Burke is Suffolk County, former Suffolk County PD, and he had done it with somebody I know, and this person I know said he was not happy with the book because
shocked.
It indicated that he might have been involved with the murders. But got to call it like you see it. There was so much research, a lot of it, from Newsday. And Newsday, it was about a year ago, I think I had a headline that said, this is when the 10th anniversary of the Gilgo Beach murders. It said, 10 years, 10 victims, 0 suspects. But then the more research I did, the more I realized that this book would be like this big, and it really lends itself to nonfiction. I was trying to fictionalize it. So, I kind of took some, I represented the corruption that I thought existed, that everybody seemed to agree existed. But then again, you have editorial issues. The editor is saying, it's kind of slowing up the book, because I said, but it's like, this stuff doesn't exist in a vacuum. I mean, it exists because of some deep corruption that, that took hold. And I make the point that, Suffolk is a fairly affluent suburban county with educated people. This is not Mississippi, I say in the book. Didn't mean to, insult Mississippi. But it was sort of like I'm saying, how did this happen here? This kind of deep corruption, which was, a lot of it was exposed because of the Gilgo Beach murders. It wasn't necessarily all connected. So that was a complex part, and I wanted to be, true to the facts. But then you get editorial pushback, it's slowing up the plot. I'm sure you've had that kind of,
Speed it up.
Right, whenever they, editors are reading it, but sometimes they're reading it in a bad mood. You don't know when they're reading it, or they're reading it when they have a hangover, and they make, and I'll give you an example of the politically correct while I'm at it. I use the word prostitutes, which, my generation, we thought this was a good word. It's not hookers, it's not, my editor said, the words that we use now is sex workers. We would like you to use the word sex workers. He said, it sounds dirtier than prostitutes, I was like, no, I mean, but I conceded a little bit. Some of the characters do use the terminology sex workers, but this is an example of the language changing. But yes, the language changes, but would these characters change? Would they, would they say sex workers and instead of prostitutes? There were some other language in there that, they considered kind of dated, but the characters who were saying it, using this language, are the kind of people who would use it. So you want to stay true to the character, but at the same time, you want to maybe, again, I had my 42-year-old son who's, read some of it, and he made some suggestions, and I'm open to some suggestions, but if I listened to everybody, the book would be so homogenized, the only one would, the reader wouldn't be happy, and ultimately, the publisher would not be happy with the sales.
Right.
I know when you're doing a series character, you know that it's either a hot series or it's not. So this was a hot series. They wanted this book, but then when they got it, they got, from the time we conceived the book till, the time the book was actually published, a lot of things had happened, defund the police, the Me Too movement. The world had changed.
Yeah.
But this book is not in that world. This book, the internal chronology of the series is some years before all of this. So you have to make these decisions that, how much do I want to make it modern like today, which it's not, because the chronology is, some years before today. So, how did we talk then? And what did we think then? That type of thing. So. This is a new thing, by the way. I mean, the editors used to do, grammar, punctuation, spelling, and then they would say, maybe you can speed this up, or you can milk this a little bit more. But now it was like, they had to use the word Orwellian, but I had this kind of Orwellian feeling that it was being read for other things other than, literary content.
What's funny is the book sort of straddles two feelings at once about the police, right? And on the one hand, obviously, is very kind of, appreciative of their service and what they do. On the other hand, it's showing a lot of very overt corruption, awful corruption, and then also even very small corruption, like the getting tickets fixed, right?
Yeah.
I'm curious what you think, as someone who's kind of part of that world, but a little bit removed, what you think about kind of the changing conversation we've had about law enforcement in the past few years and where we are now.
Sounds like a loaded question, Mark. I don't know if I can answer that. It's complex. It's a very complex, I was never a cop, so I don't know. I don't know that world from the inside, only from the outside. I know that, it becomes like it is a subculture. For sure it's a subculture. I just spent 3 years in the Army, and I saw that the Army worked the way they wanted it to work, not how anybody else wanted it to work. When you get those kinds of organizations, that are, that are institutions. They're going to work internally differently than than what the public sees, and but it is complex. And you said before, some cops are, are squeaky clean, and some are like somewhere in between, and some are, bad guys who got on the force, because they had bad motives to get on the force. This is what they try to root out, obviously. So, it's a whole different world, and it changes from, jurisdiction to jurisdiction. One of my books, Spencerville, shows a small town with a bully police chief who, runs roughshod over the whole town. And that was an honest look at a small town with a bully police chief. People have very strong opinions about things like, the police. So you gotta either you try to tell it like it is, and you try to show both sides. Yeah. Which is more important.
Yeah. I think one of the most enjoyable parts of this book is the way you kind of try to tell it like it is, and especially with little things like the tradecraft that John Corey knows and learns, right? Like putting your finger against the mirror to see if it's a two-way view. Right. Do you have any favorites of those, or how did you pick those up, that tradecraft experience?
Where did I pick that one up from? FBI guy, the two-way mirror.
Really?
I've learned stuff over the years, and I don't feel like I could, but I could I do a book about the FBI, the CIA? Probably not, because I could, but I'd have to, again, immerse myself into that world. Some of the stuff, like in the chase scenes at the end, and again, I won't give it away. A lot of it was really military stuff that I learned on an escape and evasion course that I took in Panama. I spent 3 weeks running around the jungle trying not to get captured, and it kind of stuck with me. And I, you transfer a lot of that to the book in some different way or another.
Sure. Well, I think we have time for one more from me, and then we're going to do some audience questions. So start thinking of your questions, get them ready, don't be shy. I think it's funny that John Corey and his detective girlfriend are both runners in the book, right? And I think Corey says at one point he thinks best while running. I just thought that was so interesting. Is that something you do? When you running, walking, like do you kind of get your ideas while you're on the move?
When I'm walking, I don't run. No, I don't run. One of my agent, a young lady who is a runner, said to me, she loved the John Corey, but she became an agent later after Corey was in about 6 books. She says, this guy doesn't do anything physical. I said, no, he drinks, he drinks scotch.
How's he in good shape?
She suggested, she says, just give him, she was right. Make him, and then he's a swimmer too, as it turns out. He swims, he runs, he does the things that, we've got to keep him in good shape to counteract all that scotch. I almost had him as a smoker, but in the first book, but that got totally nixed,
He doesn't seem like a smoker to me. He's a little too straight.
Well, I think he do a cigar now.
Yeah, exactly. Well, so I think we're going to go to some questions if people have. So I think what we're going to do is if you could raise your hand, and we're going to come to you, and we'll give you a mic, because it's being recorded, so you do need to speak into the mic. So yeah, and please stand up if you don't mind.
Hi, thank you for having us here tonight.
Thank you.
One of the things I've admired about you over the years is not just your writing, but the fact what you've done for literacy organizations and the raising of money. Yeah. And what prompted you to have people donate large sums of money to your fundraising organizations to have their names in your book? And how much about have you raised in doing that?
Oh, well, okay, everybody heard the question. Well, years ago, to raise money for charities, I used to, they used to auction lunch with Nelson DeMille or dinner with Nelson DeMille. I don't know why anybody would want to do that, but and I'm not really a luncher, so I kind of nixed that. But they did the dinners, and quite frankly, they went for a lot of money. Usually it's 4 to 6, 8 people at dinner. It was like, as much as $20,000. So, Susan Isaacs, who's, we all know Susan from, her books. she said to me, Nelson, these dinners with these fans, they might be nice, but it takes like forever to set it up, you know. Somebody won this thing, and they and their wife are, you know, trying to find 3 or 4 other couples that are available at the same time, or can. Sometimes it took 6 months to set them up. She says, do what I do. She said, do character in a book. I said, what is character in a book, Susan? She said, you know, for that kind of money, there's an auction for charity. People get their names put in a book, and so about, I don't know, about 20 years ago, I started doing it that way and avoiding the dinners. It was not that I had no problem with the dinner, just setting it up. This is much simpler. And, you know, normally, you know, if it's a good charity, like, you know, my son has Crohn's, and colitis, and you raise $50,000 to $20,000, and which is great. And over the years, how much, I don't know. That's a good question. I have to, but it's, you know, it's a substantial amount of money. All I have to do is put these people in the book, and they, you know, they have to sign a waiver so they don't sue me.
Yeah, does anyone get angry at you if it's a bad character?
Well, that's it. I try not to. I try to, you know, but it is tricky sometimes, and, you know.
Right. I think
anyway, over here.
Over here?
Yeah, somebody there.
Hi.
Hi.
If you could choose any actor, living or deceased, to play John Corey, who would you choose?
Who would I pick for John Corey? Well, you know, when the first book came out, the Plum Island book, it was, everybody said he sounds like Bruce Willis, so he acts like Bruce Willis. And this is a true story. One day, my office, my secretary, this is before cell phones were that common, my, you know, office phone, and she said, Bruce Willis is on the line, like to talk to you. I said, you know, Diane, he's somebody selling something. She said, no, it's Bruce Willis. I recognize his voice. So I took it, and we actually had a mutual friend. He said, I understand I'm supposed to be John Corey. I said, I don't know, Bruce, but I did have him in mind. I said, have you read Plum Island? I only had the one book out at the time. He said, no, but I'm supposed to read the book. You know, I said, no. I said, you are Bruce. I said, you are John Corey. I said, which was not true. I said, I kind of modeled the character after you, Bruce. So he wanted to do it, but, you know, Hollywood and things don't go the way you want them to go. But he was still actually, you know, one of the people that we did consider. The movie rights to the book, to Plum Island and the Lions Game, were bought by Columbia Motion Pictures, so they had the clout, you know, to get Bruce Willis. Alec Baldwin was also interested, and there was somebody else interested. I can't remember the name offhand, but it's a great part for, you know, a male actor, and the female parts are great because they're kind of, you know, Sandra Bullock is what I picture Beth Penrose as, but we have not made the movie so far. But we're working now with Sony, which is Columbia Motion Pictures, I guess their TV division. To make a series, a John Corey series, so see what happens.
Sir, this was a real missed opportunity to sell yourself as John Corey. I don't know, it's a big mistake. Other questions?
How you doing?
Good.
Thank you again for having us. If you could team up John Corey with any other fictional character and kind of have a collab, who would that be?
Nice.
Well, that's a tough question. I'm trying to think. Not just my fictional character, but another.
You mentioned Lee Child earlier, like a Jack Reacher.
Yeah, you know, one of the things that inspired the Corey series after Plum Island was this kind of like honest not honest, but, you know, kind of direct NYPD guy now working for the feds, and the clash of cultures. This is what really, in many ways, sparked a lot of these books. You know, and the FBI guys I know think it's funny, but they don't think it's funny in some ways because the FBI doesn't always come across that well. And John Corey is, you know, straightforward. And so the characters that he would come across, like his old boss, who turned out to be involved with his wife. So it would have to be somebody like that, some straight shooting FBI type agent or CIA agent, but a fictional character. Gosh, who's a good FBI agent? Long
Do you like
ago?
Stan from The Americans, you know?
Oh, right, from the Americans.
Agent
right,
Beeman
yeah.
or whatever.
Somebody like that. It would have to be a clash of cultures kind
Yeah.
of guy. Corey is who he is, and the other guy's a little bit more polished,
Right.
and they clash. So yeah, it's not a bad idea actually.
We'll take a cut, you know? Yeah.
Hi.
Hi.
I've read every single one of your books except
Thank
for
you.
maybe 3. I wanted to ask you to go back about, you were talking about researching the Gilgo murders and then deciding to fictionalize it, and it sounds like you did with Nightfall and the TWA 800 flight. So would you talk about that and maybe how you came to write that book?
Yeah, that was the only other. That's a good point. I mean, I only did 2 books based on real, historical or actual situations. The other one was Nightfall. It was about TWA 800. With that book, that was the first one I did, and that was much closer to, very close to, everything that we knew at that time. And I really wove all the facts that I knew and all the speculations and the conspiracy theories all into the same book, all into that story. And when you novelize something, whether it be the Kennedy assassination, whatever, you don't want to exploit the tragedy. I mean, 270 some people died in the TWA crash. There are people who are going to accuse you of exploiting it, but it's not what you're doing. You're trying to illuminate it in another way, and it sounds very literary, but you're trying as a novelist to come into this thing, TWA 800, for instance, and the Gilgo Beach murders, to kind of maybe refocus people on it, maybe refocus authorities on it if the book is big enough. And the Gilgo Beach, was so complex that I just decided to, totally fictionalize it as opposed to what I did with Nightfall and TWA 800. It was, those 2 books are probably the biggest challenge I've ever had, because I had to do the real research. It's the biggest challenge I've ever, right. Would I do it again? No. After I did TWA 800 in my book Nightfall, I said never again will I try to do something like that, like a Kennedy assassination, fictionalized. But the Gilgo Beach murders, because we live here, and that's been going on for, now it's 11 years. When I started the book, it was 9 years. And I just said, there's something here. And it wasn't just the murders, it wasn't just who done it. It was like it was like the corruption that was around it. It was also the fact that nobody could solve this. I mean, I found it fascinating that there was when there's no forensic evidence, usually how a case is cracked, and correct me if I'm wrong with any homicide cops here, is somebody usually comes forward. Somebody knows what happened to those 10 women, and somebody's got to come forward. Which is what usually happens. Somebody rats somebody else out. Somebody in jail tells us, but this hasn't happened. I think we're all fascinated by the fact that these murders occurred, and even with all our modern forensics and police science, we can't figure out who did it. Will it be solved? I think it will, because somebody will come forward. It won't be solved forensically because that's already passed. But from the beginning of the book, when I first started writing it, I said, I think I'm on the wrong. Maybe I shouldn't do this. This is, one of the first times I said, I think I'm not really. I don't know how to approach this. But I kind of got into it little by little, and when I decided that I was going to make it more fiction than fact, I think that kind of, opened it up for me. Would I do it again? No. When I was writing the book, I started it over 2 years ago, and I was hoping, like a good citizen, that these murders would be solved, but not until the book was published. So.
Still time.
And there's always a problem when you're doing a book. A book has a 2-year lead time, 2.5 years from the time you decide what you're going to do. And, the world has changed in those 2.5 years. So, there's a lady right here who's been.
It's such a short question. I was just curious about your writing life. what time of the day do you like to write? And when you're sitting down writing, do you write in script? Do you write in print? When I see pictures of you, you're on like a legal pad, and I don't know if you write that way, or are you on a word processor on the computer? And does an editor do you hire someone to print it out first for you and then give it to your editor? Or does your editor take your pads? I'm curious about stuff like that. Yeah.
Well, the process, yeah. Well, first, I am not a morning writer. I don't know who I am in the morning. I mean, I asked the same question to other authors, and my friend, the late Mary Higgins Clark, I said, Mary, when do you write? She said, I get up at 6, I have some tea, and I write in the morning. Then I go to lunch with my friends, and then I'm off for the rest of the day, and I don't want to write anymore. And I'm thinking, I can't even think until I had more than a cup of tea, So I usually start around noon, 1 o'clock, but I'm a night writer. I like to write, late into the night sometimes, and I've really written until the sun rises. You think you're creating, incredible literature at 3 o'clock in the morning, but then when you reread it, later that day, it's not that good. But at least you did it. It's down on paper. I don't type, so all my manuscripts are handwritten. I do usually 2 or 3 drafts handwritten. The third draft is the one that's neat enough that my assistant can type from it. And then she types and she prints out. I don't read on the screen. And then I edit it the old-fashioned way, with a pencil, a blue pencil or a red pencil. And I make, those, and then she, puts it back through the computer. And I usually do 2 or 3 drafts that way. And then, when I'm happy with the chapters, and then all the chapters are assembled at the end, give it a final read. It usually takes 16 to 18, 19 hours to read a book. So the last read you want to do sitting down, in one day. You got to block out the world, and I read it from beginning to end. Well, then make the last correction, send it to the editor, thinking that it's perfect. I wrote it, and then he comes back with editorial comments in the margins and memos and but my son made a point that when you see a movie, a 90-minute movie, 95 minutes, almost everybody's seeing it the same way. They're seeing it sitting down in the theater or TV. When you read a book, one reader's reading 10 pages a day, another reader is on the beach, managed to do half a book. Some people on a rainy weekend will read the whole book. Other people will take 6 months to write it because they really are not to read it. So the pacing is a challenge because you don't know how people are reading the book, and you can only guess how people. They're going to read chapter by chapter. At least that's why the chapters have to be kind of self-contained. So, but to answer the question, what I tried to do is turn in, I think every writer's dream is to turn in a perfect manuscript. The editor can't find anything, but editors always find something. But they're reading it differently sometimes. Sometimes they don't get the joke, it goes over their head.
Oh,
they don't get the subtlety, and then you say, well, maybe it was me. Maybe it was too subtle. Maybe I have to look at this. So then it goes through the editorial process, and that can take a month sometimes. And you have to be patient, with the editor. The editor needs to be patient with the author. That never happens, but you have to respect each other too. And since COVID, we really were never able to sit down together. So it's all been done, over the phone and by email. The process changed a bit, but it was a slower process, but it was okay. This book had a lot of issues because of the politically incorrect. A lot of the language was, offensive to my editor at Simon & Schuster. And that was an easy solvable problem. I just moved to Scribner, to a new editor. But then I heard from a very reliable source that this book had been given out to a sensitivity reader. Now, I don't know if that's true. It sounds like something that could happen. These sensitivity readers are not in-house, they're hired. And they're reading for not grammar, punctuation, and spelling, they're reading other things. This may not be true, but I heard it from what I thought was a reliable source. And if it wasn't true, I like to believe it's true because it sounds good, but it could be true. But certainly my initial editor was reading it for other things. But when you're writing it, you think it's okay, but then you're gonna, and I don't give it to the editor right away. I do give it to my son, and my assistant's been with me 20-some years, is as good a reader as anybody, and she can, and this is, and it's from a woman's point of view. This is what I'm looking for too, at the end of the day, you listen to. You listen to not so much criticism, but what I call constructive criticism. Some of it is good, some of it is bad, and then you got to make those decisions too. So a year and a half later, hopefully you have a book. How some authors write a book every 6 months is beyond me.
Insane.
You're still working on your second book after some years. But this is a good chance for me to tell my James Patterson joke. I know Jim. So I called to his house one day, and his wife Ann answered, and she said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Nelson, he can't come to the phone. He's writing a book." I said, "That's okay. I'll hold." That's my Jim Patterson.
I think we have time for one more quick one, right?
It's great to be here, and I love hearing you talk and everyone talking about John Corey. And he's definitely the guy that you want to date but not marry,
Right.
which is perfect.
You got it.
But also, you write great women characters, and how they, like the one-liners that they give back to him
Right.
are amazing. And even with Tess, with texting back to him. And
Right.
so, do you have people like women that you go to and say, what would you say, or how would you say this?
Yeah.
What would your
absolutely.
response be?
Absolutely. My late wife, who passed away 4 years ago, was my primary reader, but also my assistant of 20-some years. Was a secondary reader in terms of women. I also have a social media person, younger, because you have to be when you're social media. I didn't understand any of this, but that wasn't her job. But she took it on. I asked her to read. So usually I have 3 women, sometimes a 4th woman. If you look in the back, there's a lot of acknowledgments there. One of the readers was, sounds funny now, but I became friendly with my female dermatologist, but she wrote a book too called The Doctor's Secret, and I have to plug it here, and you can go on Amazon and find it. And she read the book, and then another friend of mine, female friend, was an attorney, and I thought that was a good reading because she was very focused. So this book had 5 female readers. And they say, women don't talk like this, women don't think like this. This woman is thinking like a guy. Women don't think about sex every 3 minutes. Guys do. Women maybe once an hour or something. But they learn. You learn something, and then you have to give it to different. If you can, I give it to Kenny Heave, who model. I use him as a model for the John Corey character, and a few other people. And it's willing acknowledged. I acknowledge everybody. John Kennedy, who's former Nassau County assistant police chief. Deputy police chief, and you get all this, you pull all this stuff in, and they know what they're talking about. It's just their world or their life. The hardest thing I do, by the way, the hardest for me, is not the gender thing so much, because I kind of got it after all these years. And it's not even socioeconomic, because you kind of can figure out how a doctor would talk, how an army officer would talk, how somebody else would talk, airline pilot, whatever I'm representing or creating. The biggest problem for me was the younger people, like adolescents. It's hard to figure out what the hell they're talking about. I have a 16-year-old, and it's like, but I don't get it. And if you see, in most of my books, I think only in one of my books I ever had an adolescent character, and I stay away from it on purpose because and their language changes from year to year anyway. So an older book written with an adolescent that goes back to, say, 1980s wouldn't sound the same today. So yeah, it's a challenge, and but I think I got the women right. What do you think?
Yeah.
Well, thank you so much, Nelson. Thank you, everyone, for coming. This is a great event. It's great to see people in person. Thanks to our partner in this series, Long Island LitFest. For more events in this series and a full list of events, you can visit newsdaylive.com. Thank you, Nelson.
Thank you.
so much.
Thank you, guys. Very good.